Hello, everybody. It's good to see all of you. Thank you for coming. And I'm Professor Ann Austin. I'm the director of the Center for Women and Gender. And it is our great privilege to host these kinds of things, the brown bags. And we're very glad that the music department allowed us to collaborate with them to host Dr. Winkler, Eubanks Winkler. So we have some of our swag up here on the table. If you feel like you need a snow scraper, pen, a copy of the Constitution, or other things, please, on your way out, check the table out and see if there are some things that you could use. Okay, Dr. Shear is going to introduce our special guest.
Thank you so much, Ann. Hello, my name is Dr. Christopher Shear. I'm Associate Professor of Musicology here at Utah State University. It's such a pleasure to see you all here today in this wonderful collaborative event between the Center for Women and Gender and our Visiting Music Scholars series in the Kane College of the Arts. In addition to the generous support from the Center for Women and Gender, I also need to acknowledge, I would like to acknowledge support from the Kane College of the Arts, especially from the differential tuition, which comes from the students of the college. So Kane College of the Arts students, thank you very much for that extra $50 or that to make this happen. It's my pleasure today to introduce Amanda Eubanks Winkler, who is Associate Professor of Music History and Cultures at Syracuse University. Professor Eubanks Winkler's research focuses on English theater music of the 17th, 18th, and 20th centuries. She is a co-investigator with the theater historian Richard Shook on Performing Restoration Shakespeare, a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK from 2017 to 2020. And she is a general editor for the collected works of John Eccles, published by AR Editions. She has published on a range of topics, including the relationships among musical, spiritual, and bodily disorder, musical depictions of the goddess Venus, the gendering of musical spirits, and the intersection of music and politics. More recently, her more recent work has engaged with performance studies and practice-based research, including workshops that staged excerpts of William Davenant's Macbeth and Charles Gilden's Measure for Measure, those both in the Folger Theater in Washington, D.C., Thomas Middleton's The Witch at Blackfriars Conference in Staunton, Virginia, and the Restoration-era Tempest at the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse in Shakespeare's Globe on Bankside in London. She is the author of the book, Oh, Let Us Howl Some Heavy Note, Music for Witches, the Melancholic, and the Mad on the 17th Century English Stage, 2 editions of Restoration-era theater music, and with Linda Austern and Candace Bailey, an essay collection, Beyond Boundaries, Rethinking Music Circulation in Early Modern England. Besides performing Restoration Shakespeare, other current projects include a book for Arden Shakespeare on William Davenant, co-authored with her collaborator from the HRC grant, and an article on George Martin's orchestral arrangements for the Beatles. Eubanks Winkler recently completed a book manuscript, Singing at School, Performance and Pedagogy in Early Modern England, and her talk today is drawn from that research. And the title of her talk is So Public a Show, Female Performance at Early Modern English Boarding Schools. Please help me welcome Dr. Eubanks Winkler.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's just been a pleasure, my visit thus far. Music history textbooks report that Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas was performed by students at dancing master Josiah Priest's boarding school in the fashionable enclave of Chelsea. Some musicologists have been uncomfortable with the fact that Purcell's only through-sung opera was performed by a bunch of amateurs, girls presenting the early modern equivalent of a high school musical. Elaborate theories have been produced to explain these less than exalted performance circumstances away, a favorite one being that Purcell's opera was actually intended for performance at court. Regardless of the circumstances of Dido's genesis, we know with absolute certainty that it was performed at Priest's school. And just as modern-day musicologists feel discomfort at the prospect of a schoolgirl performance, so too did spectators then. In 1691, Mrs. A. Buck wrote to her friend Mary Clark about the goings-on at Priest's school. Slide, please. Priests at Little Chelsea was one which was much commended, but he hath lately had an opera, which I'm sure hath done him a great injury, and the parents of the children not satisfied with so public a show. Mrs. A. Buck, the woman who took umbrage at the opera at Priest's School, had a range of reasons to object to the performance. By the late 17th century, opera in England had become associated, at least for some, with the Tory party, and Buck and her correspondent, Mary Clark, were associated with the rival Whigs. Beyond any politically motivated disapproval, however, lurked something else. According to Buck, the parents of the children at Priest's were upset that it was so public a show. Why was being public such a bad thing? And what precisely did public mean to Buck and others during the period? As I've demonstrated with my colleagues in a recent book, Beyond Boundaries, the edge between public and private, amateur and professional, was a tremendously fluid one with regards to early modern English music. To answer the question of why public was a pejorative for Buck then, we must consider the spatial and geographical situation of the boarding school, as well as the long-standing and complicated relationships among performing children and professional actors, dancers, and musicians in early modern England. As we shall see, public was dangerously close to professional in early modern England, a person accessible to all through payment, a commodity. I became interested in the publicness of these shows after reading a recent early music article by Brian White. He describes a discovery, a letter from Aleppo written by Rowland Sherman, a factor of the Levant Company stationed in what is now Syria, to his merchant friend James Pigott in London. Sherman asked Pigott to send him a harpsichord arrangement of the symphony from Harry's Masque, made for a ball at Josiah Priest's Chelsea boarding school, seemingly a reference to Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. Predictably, the discovery of Sherman's letter reopened scholarly debate about Dido, but from the vantage point of my study, the most interesting thing about White's discovery was not the possibility that Dido was first performed at Priest's School rather than at court, or that the date of this performance had to be 1687 or 88, not 1689, as had previously been thought, because of the timing of Sherman's departure for Aleppo. Rather, I was intrigued by the notion that concert-loving merchants such as Sherman attended these school balls, and that such performances appeared to have been part of a larger tradition. I'm not the first to be interested in operatics at boarding schools for girls. As others have noted, the performance of Dido at Priest's School was not unusual. Slide, please. Other musical works, including Thomas Duffett's Beauty's Triumph of 1676 and John Blow's Venus and Adonis, which was performed at Chelsea in 1684, were performed at this boarding school. That merchants such as Sherman seem to view these performances as just another entertainment option is intriguing, suggesting that such occasions were not purely pedagogical and that they reached consumers beyond prospective students and doting relatives. Indeed, Sherman's casual mention might indicate that they formed an established part of a region's, in this case London's, musical offerings. The girls were entertainers as well as students, and as we shall see, the social liminality of their position caused considerable anxiety for those who mounted the shows and for some audience members. The liminality was not only social, however. In considering schoolgirl operatic performance in England in the late 17th century, I focus particularly on two well-documented locations, the famous school in Chelsea and the lesser-known one at Besselsley, a village near Oxford, both of which were on the geographical margins of burgeoning urban centers, and both of which seem to have relied equally on proximity to and distance from these centers to ensure the success and moral probity of their institutions. Locating early modern English opera within a school-based context enriches our understanding of canonical works such as Dido and Aeneas and Venus and Adonis. It also challenges our assumptions about amateur and professional musicians, or to use Christopher Marsh's helpful formulation, recreational and occupational musicians. And, most importantly in the context of this talk, it connects both of these topics with a re-examination of our preconceptions about where opera might be performed. It was not only in public opera houses or theaters. Just as recreational, occupational, schoolroom, stage, and public-private distinctions were porous in early modern England, so too were generic designations, not least because performance circumstances were variable, even when associated with the professional theater. Music played a substantial role in English operatic entertainments in the period, even if there was also spoken dialogue. Such works are called by various generic distinctions: masque, opera, dramatic opera, even ball. Thus, for the purposes of this talk, opera is defined capaciously. Slide, please. The operatic performances under consideration in this talk took place at institutions that were in close proximity to, but not directly in, the middle of urban centers. Some of the most famous London-based schools were not in the city, that is, within the bounds of the old Roman wall, or in fashionable Westminster or Covent Garden, although there were schools there too. They were instead in London's affluent suburbs or in the rural outskirts. Aside from Chelsea, other well-known girls' schools were located in Hackney and Putney. This positioning may seem surprising, but the first half of the 17th century saw an increase in travel by coach, including the development of coach hire ranks in London, which enabled social as well as physical movement, and would have allowed girls, teachers, and parents to travel to these schools. Others, such as John Verney, whose niece attended Priest School in Chelsea, owned their coach. New roads were built to accommodate the heavier traffic flow, further facilitating travel. Urban dwellers during this period engaged in skirting behaviors, moving regularly among city center and emergent suburb and even rural spaces. Margaret Pelling explains that these skirters were town dwellers following patterns of living which involved avoidance of, as much as commitment to, urban environments. Why suburban and rural schoolmasters might have chosen locations within reasonable distance of urban centers but not directly in them, exclusivity, moral concerns, pastoral healthfulness, or even the cost and availability of suitable houses, is not clear, but given these habits and new modes of transportation, it would have been relatively simple for those living in urban centers to attend school-based performances. The location of these boarding schools was also redolent with cultural meanings. Then, as now, neighborhoods had specific associations mutually created by the people who lived within them and outside them. For instance, the physical location of public theaters across the river in Suffolk in Shakespeare's time reveals much about the anxieties of early modern English society. The Rose and later the Globe were purposely located on the margins, outside the city walls. On the other hand, the locations of Chelsea and Besselsley schools signified an aspiration to align with privilege and intellectual capital, in Besselsley's relative proximity to prosperous Oxford and fashionability in the case of Chelsea. Chelsea in particular was an extremely desirable location. It is now, too. Known for its grand houses along the river and its popularity with courtiers in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, when many of these manor houses had been built. These choices of locations also suggest negotiation of a balance between the need on the one hand to be accessible to staff based in urban centers and on the other to separate the girls from the immoral temptations of the urban center. The implicit desire for removal from temptation was as relevant to the fortunes of Besselsley as it was to Chelsea. Oxford, the nearest urban center to Besselsley, was booming in the late 17th century, the university expanding significantly during this period with the building of the Sheldonian Theatre and the Old Ashmolean Museum. Oxford residents were generally wealthy thanks to a robust service sector and enjoyed various entertainments and diversions from which some may have wanted their daughters removed, thus the desirability of sending them to Besselsley. Slide, please. Locations near Oxford and London proved particularly appealing for school-based performance for practical reasons. Proprietors often had participated in the performing arts themselves in the urban centers or had close associations with urban musicians, dancing masters, and playwrights. Usually women ran the institution's day-to-day operations, which were designed to educate girls in the ornamental arts and make them more marriageable. The female proprietor administered the school, sent out tuition bills, interacted with students and parents, and hired musicians and dancing masters to work as freelancers at additional charge to students. Sometimes these administrators had close associations with or were married to a musician or dancing master who may have viewed running a school as a sensible way of procuring a regular income. Hannah Playford, the wife of music publisher John Playford, for example, ran a school opposite the church in Islington. She advertised in her husband's publication Choice Airs of 1679, stating that her pupils might, quote, be instructed in all manner of curious work, as also reading, writing, music, dancing, and the French tongue, end quote. Frank, also known as Frances Priest, the wife of dancing master Josias Priest, similarly ran the day-to-day operations at the famously musical Chelsea boarding school from 1680 onwards. Around the same time, a dancing master named Mr. Hazard ran a school in Chelsea jointly with his wife. When Mrs. Hazard died in 1682, her husband made clear that he would hire a woman to look after the girls and the household, as it was apparently inappropriate for a man to run a girls' school without the presence of a woman. The most prominent boarding school in the late 17th century England with regard to operatic performance was undoubtedly the one in Chelsea, which sponsored lavish events described as balls. Brian White has suggested that these balls were probably held on a yearly basis in spring, but at least in the years between 1684 and 1686. It is unknown when the school opened, but by 1676, the professional musicians Geoffrey Bannister and James Hart were running a boarding school there. If you could put the slide up. Yeah. In that house, which was formerly Sir Arthur Gorges, as described on the title page of the printed version of Beauty's Triumph, a masque given at the school. The house, a typical Elizabethan gabled structure, was built by Sir Arthur at the west end of the village around 1617 to 1619. And you can see it, maybe, over there in the corner. This house was sold after his death in 1661, and after Bannister and Hart's tenure was later rented to Josias Priest in 1680. As was typical for staff at London area boarding schools, Bannister and Hart also held positions at court. Bannister was a member of the 24 Violins, and Hart was a bass in the Chapel Royal. After Priest and his wife Frank took over the school in November 1680, it appears that Hart continued on as a singing teacher, judging by a bill dated January 20th, 1685, listing his name. Josias Priest was a well-established dancing master who had previously run schools in Holborn and Leicester Fields, and he may have also provided choreography for the London stage. In addition to Priest's role as school dancing master, one presumes Frank and Josias hired friends and acquaintances from court and stage to fill out their staff. Slide, please. Beside James Hart, the preface to Thomas Durfee's play, Love for Money, or The Boarding School of 1691, tells us that the playwright lived at the school for a time, although whether he taught students is unclear. Similarly, the relationship between Thomas Duffett, the author of Beauty's Triumph, and the Chelsea School is shrouded in mystery. Slide, please. We know less about the boarding school operating in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, about 5 miles to the west of Oxford, in the village of Besselsley, although music and dance apparently played a significant role there as well. Anthony Wood writes of, quote, a solemn ball held at the school between October 23rd and 25th, 1694, quote, in the house of Sir John Lentil, performed by 50 or 60 maids, virgins of quality, that are sojourners under the government of ... end quote. Wood apparently did not know the name of the schoolmaster, thus the frustrating ellipses. Evidence is lacking in other regards, too. Only scraps of information are known about the school's personnel, but it appears at least 1 or perhaps 2 Oxford music faculty members were involved. Musica Oxiensis of 1698 includes 3 songs from, slide please, The Masque of Orpheus and Eurydice, performed at the boarding school at Besselsley in October 1697, composed by the then Heather Professor of Music at Oxford, Richard Goodson. Slide please. Similarly, the new college organist, John Weldon, appointed in 1694, published Stop, O Ye Waves as Orpheus's Song to the Vaves in the Masque of Orpheus and Eurydice in Mercurius Musicus. At least one other professional may have been brought in for Besselsley's Masque of Orpheus and Eurydice. The Mercurius Musicus song sheet indicates that a Mrs. Lindsay performed as Orpheus. Mary Lindsay was a singer whose first known role was as a follower of Cynthia in Akalna Settle's The World and the Moon, which was performed at Dorset Garden Theatre in June 1697. She remained active on the London stage until 1713. Perhaps for this pivotal role, the organizers hired a professional to bolster the talents of the schoolgirl cast, although the printed song may have recorded a London concert performance. Indeed, this highly ornamented printed version of the song might preserve something of Lindsay's performance, whether at Besselsley or in concert. Lindsay's possible participation in the Besselsley performance suggests just how permeable the boundary was between recreational and occupational musicians. Even if Mercurius Musicus records a concert performance, it is still significant, for it shows the circulation of didactic musical repertory beyond the school's walls into the concert room. The involvement of occupational musicians, both regular teachers and occasional hires, was almost certainly vital to operatic productions in the schools. Evidence from other contexts as well as from surviving sources associated with the school performances at Chelsea and Besselsley suggests that the girls often performed alongside their teachers or possibly other professionals. Earlier in the century, schoolmasters as well as music and dancing masters from girls' schools performed with their students, as did additional professionals on occasion. Slide, please. For example, its banishment of 1617, girls from Robert White's school in Deptford performed at Greenwich alongside their schoolmaster, a few court musicians, and the sons of local dignitaries. Slide, please. Thomas Jordan's Cupid's Coronation of 1654, performed at Christ's Hospital, was given by masters and young ladies that were their scholars. This mode of performance likely continued unabated after the Restoration. For instance, the printed text of Beauty's Triumph calls for violins, recorders, and flageolets, but because woodwind instruments were considered inappropriate for women to play, it is possible that some of Bannister's and Hart's friends from court were imported for the event. Slide, please. Blurring of boundaries could also occur on stage in these performances in ways that potentially problematize not only the teacher-pupil relationship, but also gender roles. Sometimes girls took male roles. Slide, please. For instance, Josiah Priest's daughter played the ill-fated huntsman in the 1684 Venus and Adonis, as John Verney recorded in his copy of the libretto. On the public stage, women playing breeches roles and wooing other women had an erotic effect upon audience members. One wonders how this registered at Priest's school. The juxtaposition of moral concerns with pedagogical aims may be apparent in manuscript materials relating to Venus and Adonis. Manuscript fragments of Venus and Adonis, copied by Richard Goodson and arranged for treble voices, may have been intended for performance by girls at Besselsley. Slide, please. The text in Goodson's copy is bowdlerized, softening the sexual content found in the primary musical source for Venus and Adonis and in Priest's school libretto. Instead of "absence kindles new desire, I would not have my lover tire," we have "thus you will the kinder prove, since absence tunes the mind to love." If Goodson's arrangement was intended for Besselsley, then perhaps the schoolmaster was less free-thinking than the priests at Chelsea. Given the undoubted anxieties about schoolgirl performance, especially in the context of concern about stage performance generally, it is somewhat surprising that the operatic entertainments given at Chelsea and Besselsley engaged with amorous love at all. Still, the purpose of sending a girl to a boarding school for improvement was to secure a good marriage, and in this context, such subject matter becomes more understandable. Works performed by schoolgirls exploited the suggestiveness of the plots and enhanced opportunities for physical display through dance and gesture on the one hand, and on the other used stories in which the moral emphasized the dangers of sexual impropriety. Thus, Venus and Adonis and Dido and Aeneas, the two most famous examples of schoolgirl opera, explore stories of illicit passion, which result in death or suffering for one of the protagonists. Beauty's Triumph and Orpheus and Eurydice similarly offered warnings to the girls about the price of pursuing love and, more specifically, sexual desire. Slide, please. The Chelsea production of Dido and Aeneas, memorialized in a surviving souvenir libretto from the performance, offers a sense of the tightrope these schoolgirl operas walked. The dances, both in the prologue and elsewhere, would have showed off the girls' terpsichorean talents to the audience. Indeed, dancing appears to have played a significant and memorable role in the entertainments at Priest's school. On the other hand, some of the dances seem potentially inappropriate for young women. For example, the dance for two drunken sailors in Act 2 of the Chelsea Dido. Teachers or other professionals might have performed these grotesque dances in keeping with earlier practice. Slide, please. Similarly, the libidinous satyrs in the Besilsley Orpheus and Eurydice called for in the song Let Me Satyrs might have been acted by male schoolteachers or professionals. Even the roles of the sorceress and her coven in Dido may have been taken by teachers or professionals. Alternatively, if these roles were taken by schoolgirls, they would have presented a challenge. It is possible that Priest wanted to demonstrate the rigor of his training in the performing arts. If the schoolgirls did perform the roles of witches and the sexually active Dido, the libretto says, one night enjoyed, the next forsook, then like the performance of Venus's erotic escapades in Venus and Adonis at the same school a few years earlier, it could have been understood as a moral counterexample, displaying vice in order to repudiate it. Slide, please. School-based operatic performances occupied an interstitial space, neither belonging to the public stage nor being, to judge from contemporary accounts, entirely private. The merchant Sherman, with whom this talk began, might have attended or at least had heard about a ball at Priest's school. Another account from 1717 indicates that men were drawn to boarding schools by the alluring young ladies. Slide. Besilsley is a mighty pleasant place. Here was a few years since a noted boarding school where were abundance of young ladies, which occasioned a more than ordinary resort thither of the young Oxford scholars. Given the accessibility of these performances to a broad range of outsiders, one can understand criticisms of their publicness, particularly as there was a persistent strand of anti-theatrical sentiment in early modern English society, a puritanical residue of pious suspicion and disapprobation of the public stage. In some cases, the performance activities of the boarding school were actually transplanted in fictionalized form to the public stage. In addition to her objections about the publicness of the operatic activities at Priest's school, Buck's letter also sniffily referred to Thomas Durfee's previously mentioned and highly ribald play, Love for More Money, or The Boarding School, which Durfee had penned after his summer sojourn in Chelsea. Slide, please. Yeah, I had to return to that. Buck declared to her friend, "At present, all schools are ridiculed. They have lately made a play called The Boarding School." Indeed, Durfee's play does not cast schoolgirl performance or the moral probity of such institutions in a flattering light. The action of the play focuses on a boarding school in Chelsea and features vapid students, a shambolically executed ball, and sleazy dancing and singing masters making sexual advances to their pupils. Although Durfee disingenuously protested that he might have set the play in York as in Chelsea, some of his contemporaries clearly interpreted it as a roman à clef. As such a plotline suggests, the presence of professional musicians and dancers at the schools and the desiring spectators who watched performances fomented considerable anxiety about the accessibility of the girls and their chastity. These anxieties play out in the prologues and epilogues to school-based entertainments. Duffett's prologue to Beauty's Triumph apologized for the entertainment's public nature. The young lady who spoke the prologue asserted, "This entertainment was intended for ourselves alone." After the masque was over, the epilogue proclaimed the chastity of the students, drawing a clear distinction from the actresses of the public stage. The girls are cloistered nuns with virtuous zeal inspired. Differences with the public stage were also delineated by the mode of address. The young lady who spoke the prologue directed it exclusively to the other ladies in the audience, establishing communication between women, ameliorating the problem of an unwed girl speaking directly to men. Although actresses on the public stage addressed men frequently, they were sexually available in a way that these students presumably were not, a distinction the prologue carefully drew. Durfey's epilogue for the revival of Dido and Aeneas in 1689 was spoken by Lady Dorothy Burke, and it deployed much of the same rhetoric regarding chastity and performance. The girls' singing did not inflame illicit passion in auditors. Rather, their vocal performance was akin to a celestial choir. All that we know the angels do above, I've read is that they sing and that they love. The girls' angelic love was chaste, for their cloistered position at the school saved them from these grand deceivers, men. Burke declared, in words Durfey framed for her, that she and her schoolmates were bred to virtue, kept behind a nunnery door charmed to shut out fools, for they were Protestants and English nuns. As in Duffett's epilogue, there was also an assertion regarding the girls' spatial and moral separation from the pleasures of London, for neither playhouse wit nor the excesses of the vile, lewd town could charm them. And I just want to pause here and note what a hypocrite Durfey was, because he also, writing all this stuff about the chastity of the students in 1689, a couple years later in 1691, writes love for money, right? Despite the clear anxieties regarding schoolgirl operatics and the young ladies' accessibility to spectators, such events still took place. Why? Aside from any advantages accruing to the proprietors, such performances provided entertainment for those inclined or invited to attend. These activities also advertised the training received at the school and showed off accomplishments to parents, relatives, and other interested parties, as well as to prospective students. The Verney correspondence strongly suggests that the latter role, demonstrating accomplishment, was extremely important. John Verney attended his niece's performance at Chelsea and reported back to her father, Edmund Munn Verney. On April 24, 1684, he wrote, "We," that is John and his wife, "were both at the ball and opera last Thursday, where we saw my niece dance and act some part in it, and truly she doth it very well, and I wish you had seen her dance. 'Twould, if it be possible, have set her a degree higher in your affections. She is a good child, and will doubtless deserve very well at your hands." In subsequent years, John and his wife took other relatives to see the grand ball as well. On April 22, 1686, he wrote to Munn, "This day, as was last Thursday, is the grand ball at Chelsea School, wherein your daughter is a great dancer. My wife carries as many of the Stukelys," that were the cousins, "as her coach can hold. Last week, 4 of that family went to it." And just a brief note, that bill I showed you that was from Frank Priest to someone, that was a bill to Munn Verney because he didn't pay his tuition. And so he was in arrears, and he ended up having to withdraw his girl from the school because he couldn't pay for it anymore. These comments indicate several things about the grand ball performances at Priest's. They were given more than once. Groups of relatives, perhaps if not in this case, including prospective suitors, attended together, and that dancing was thought to be a highly desirable skill, a sign of goodness and perhaps filial obedience, and thus a spur to fatherly approbation. Schools also used performance as a strategy for recruiting new students, although not always with success. While we lack evidence about this practice for girls' boarding schools, performance played a key role in student recruitment at young gentlemen's academies. Much earlier in the century, Francis Kynaston's failed academy for gentlemen, Museum Minervae, located in Kynaston's own lodgings in fashionable Bedford Street, Covent Garden, put on public presentations of music and other shows. The school trained the nobility in military pursuits as well as the arts. To advertise the latter in The Constitutions of the Museum Minerva, Keniston mentioned, the day of public music is Tuesday, beginning at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and mandated that to public shows, presentations, and music meetings, none shall be admitted, but such as shall bring with them the character, that is proof of gentility, which shall be given forth by the regent for that time. At least in one instance, a mass, Corona Minerva, presented before Prince Charles, the Duke of York, and their sister Lady Mary in 1635, was performed in an effort to procure patronage and to demonstrate the talents of students and teachers. In 1649, Sir Balthazar Gerbier, a Huguenot émigré, opened a similar academy for gentlemen at his house at Bethnal Green, a decidedly pastoral location then, that offered music and dance instruction. Like Keniston, he sought support through music making, but this strategy backfired. According to several proceedings in Parliament, the free public lectures his academy sponsored sometimes included an academical entertainment of music or an intermixture of pleasing music. Unfortunately, although he provided ticketed reserved seating for all honorable persons, and notwithstanding his removed location, too many people of the lower sort attended these events, and his academy began to lose elite students as a result. John Bannister, another musician come master, sponsored the performance of music, or a parley of instruments, in 1676, featuring music masters at his Gentlemen's Academy in Little Lincoln's Inn Fields, possibly in an attempt to generate publicity and draw prospective students. According to the word book for parley, the scholar's teaching dictated that performances could not begin until 6 o'clock in the evening. The scholars at the Academy were not, however, the primary performers of parley, as a contemporary advertisement indicated that it was performed by eminent masters, professionals who were employed for the occasion. Thus, parley, in both its printed and performed iterations, served to bring attention to Bannister's educational enterprise, facilitated through his contacts with the London professional music scene. In all these cases, the school-based entertainment's accessibility was facilitated by the institution's proximate location to urban centers. But this very proximity fomented moral anxieties, particularly where girls were concerned. As the prologues and epilogues to works given at Chelsea and accounts of the scholars from Oxford visiting Besselsley make clear, temptations of the town, either directly or via the staff or audience members, might render the girls sexually vulnerable. At Chelsea, there was a clear desire to separate the girls' performances from those of morally dubious stage professionals, while Anthony Wood's description of Besselsley emphasizes the students' virginity. Yet, given the somewhat public nature of these performances and the fact that the teaching staff was drawn from the professional musicians who circulated between schools and urban centers, claims about the girls being safely cloistered were clearly untrue. Perhaps the rhetoric of the nunnery, in a country for which the cloistered Catholic votary was exotically or historically distant, was itself an anxiously overdone attempt to address that concern. Such discourses, like the works themselves and the networks within which they were developed and circulated, suggests the contested and varied environments in which English opera developed, as well as the lack of clear definition between public and private, amateur and professional during the period. Thank you. Yes, please.
I have one. You mentioned that women didn't play woodwind instruments, so I'm curious about that.
Right. So it goes back to a comment in Castiglione's The Courtier, in which he says that women playing woodwind instruments distorts their face and is overly suggestive. Yeah. And so women generally did not play those instruments because of this thought that it was unseemly for them to do so. Yeah.
I'm so curious about the prologues and epilogues, the particular challenge that presents because of the way that that's this direct for the audience. And I'm curious about whether you ever have run across any overlap or connection or comparisons to the young, very young girls who were employed at this time in London to perform, sexually suggested
yes,
blogs like Miss Porter at Lincoln's Inn Fields.
Letitia Cross did some of that too.
And so I'm curious because clearly for them, the fact that they were young did not stop the theaters from
sexualizing them. Yeah.
So I'm curious about that.
Well, I think that the girls at the boarding schools were totally sexualized as well. I think that they were talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? Because in order to keep getting parents to send them there, they had to draw some kind of dividing line between their performance activities and what was happening on the public stage. As you point out, there were kids on the public stage or, young girls put in these sexual situations all the time. They somehow wanted to do the same thing in the boarding schools. And, Venus and Adonis, we have the Chelsea libretto. They didn't redact it at all. It's a very sexy little opera. And Dido and Aeneas, too. I mean, it has all of this amorous behavior in it. And so they wanted to have that, but then they also wanted to frame it and say, oh, but really they're chaste. Right? And so I think that's definitely what's going on there, is that especially when you get to the late 17th century, there's this real anxiety to try to draw a line between these performance activities in the boarding schools and what was going on the public stage or even at court, right? Because it was a libertine environment at court as well, especially with Charles. And I think that that's what was going on. But it was completely disingenuous. It was kind of a rhetorical position, I think. But they had to have that pretense in order to have parents keep wanting to send their kids there. But as Buck's letter suggests, not everybody bought that, and people saw through it. And even Durfee, who lived there, didn't buy it. I mean, his play, oh my goodness, really. He really just, if we believe that even a small portion of what he suggests went on at the Chelsea boarding school went on, then it was certainly not a cloistered environment for those girls. Yeah.
What about when the girls grew up and maybe they did become wives, but I would probably guess that there's some who didn't, who probably went on to do the public stage.
That's an interesting point. Actually, we have no evidence of that, and in part it has to do with class. The girls who went to these schools were generally daughters of the merchant class, as was the case, like Verney was the younger brother, John Verney, and he was a merchant in London and was actually involved in various ways with that Levant company that I was talking about. His older brother, though, was like the heir to the land, but he was totally dissolute and always broke and couldn't pay for stuff. Because of class, they were of a slightly higher class, however, even the merchants, so their daughters would not have gone onto the public stage. This was purely to give them training in order to be good hostesses in a domestic setting. Oh, I can play the virginals for my guests, or oh, I can sing a nice little song for my husband. That's what it was really for. Or I can do embroidery really well and make these handicrafts at home. Some of these schools taught cookery as well, so it was really geared towards making a good marriage match. And I think that some of the eroticism of these entertainments were kind of putting the girls on to display for potential suitors as well. I think that's what was going on. We do know what happened to the girl who was a good dancer, Munverney's daughter. She ends up running away and eloping with somebody against her dad's wishes. So she was a bit of a problem child, but she kind of took after her dad. He was a problematic guy as well. Yeah.
What would have been the proficiency level expected of the girls during this time, maybe compared to the general proficiency that we see with young children now, or young teenagers?
I would say, then as now, it varies widely. Procuring accomplishment was an expensive proposition, right? So if you were of a class where you could pay for all of these things, then you could achieve performative proficiency across multiple disciplines at a very high level. And we know this because of some of the pedagogical manuscripts that were used to teach girls and boys. It's very difficult music. And so clearly they were able to achieve a high level of proficiency. Dido and Aeneas is not the most difficult thing Purcell wrote by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still not really super easy to sing, right? It still presents its challenges. So they were able to perform at a pretty high level of proficiency, but it was very much along class lines. If you could pay for all of these things, like now, then you can achieve a higher level of performance.
Were there any charity schools that brought in children of the working class or the farmers or whatever to try to educate them, especially in the arts?
Yes. So grammar schools for boys that were established, oftentimes they would take in charity students, and sometimes they put on performances that included music at these grammar schools for boys. Shakespeare went to one and probably learned something about how to do playwriting from his experiences with some of the classical playwrights like Terence. There was also Christ's Hospital, which I mentioned in this talk, which is a school that was established by Edward VI, and it was specifically for orphans or the poor. And sometimes the orphans were of quite high-class pedigree, but they just ended up being orphans and needed that kind of support. And at those schools, they kind of talked out of both sides of their mouth. So on the one hand, they wanted apprenticeship to happen. Early days, they said, we don't want to apprentice to musicians. On the other hand, they always had a music master, and they ended up putting on, and they did a lot of religious singing, we know, at that school. There's a whole repertory of Easter anthems that exist for those schools that they would perform at Easter as they parade through the streets in their distinctive outfit, their uniform, these blue coats, and then they'd go to Spittal Cross and they'd perform these anthems. And so there was that kind of performance. But some of them were also performing masks, and there were girls and boys at that school. So that Mass Cupid's Coronation, that was for the girls at Christ's Hospital. So in that case, it serves a slightly different purpose, because if they're good at music, they might be able to make an even better marriage match than they would otherwise, because they'll have that kind of accomplishment. So it's really crucial for them, because they don't necessarily have a support system. And maybe some of them might have gone onto the public stage because they weren't necessarily of the higher class pedigree that a girl who went to Chelsea would have been. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. You first. Yes.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, you were mentioning some of the hospital sort of orphanages that would exist, that would exist for different classes. Is there any sort of tie between that and then similar things that went on in other countries? Like,
yeah.
With all these...
The ospedale or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's a similar kind of charitable impulse. We have these group of, in both Vivaldi's case, girls, and in the case of Christ's Hospital, girls and boys, that we want to give them some kind of sense of training that they can then go out and make a living for themselves. And so some of the musical training at the ospedale, you know, it again, maybe it could help them make a better marriage match, but it also gave them this kind of polish. And I think that's what was happening at Christ's Hospital as well.
I love the talk so much. So I had another question. You were talking about the transportation networks making this possible.
Yeah.
And I was really curious. I think maybe this has to do with class, and that's the answer to this question. But I've run across things around the 1705 subscription to make the Queen's Opera House in Haymarket.
Yeah.
Where one of the many explanations for its failure that's offered is it's too hard to get there.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Like, who can afford that?
Yeah.
And maybe it's because they just were figuring out that you can't run a whole opera house on the number of people who can afford that. But I guess I was curious if that tells us something about the kinds of people who are coming to these, or if you ran across any of those.
Yeah. The people who would have been going, well, Verney, I mean, who you know, was traveling around in his coach and owned his own coach, he was a merchant. So he could clearly afford it. So I wouldn't necessarily take that at face value. I mean, opera in the early 18th century in London was such a fraught proposition. You had a lot of things. So after Purcell dies, you know, there was perceived to be this kind of vacuum, which isn't entirely true, but the great Orpheus Britannicus is dead. And there was also this encroachment of Italian opera at the same time. And so in the early 18th century, and a lot of anxieties around that. And in terms of programming at Van Breu's kind of Haymarket, it's interesting to kind of look at what they were hoping to program there. So they were trying to do some English stuff, like the British Enchanters was 1706, and then they had some of this Italian stuff there as well. I think it also had to do with theatrical politics, and it was so crazy. They kept switching back and forth as to which theater could perform opera, and then the other theater was only supposed to do straight plays. I mean, it was just really a mess at that time. And so I don't think its location was really a reason for failure necessarily, although they might have claimed that. It wasn't like it was that far away. Chelsea's further away than Haymarket is. So, yeah.
I got a question about when the people came to these operas at boarding school, did they actually pay for it? Was it expensive? Was
Yeah.
it cheap? What was the relationship there?
Yeah, we have no evidence. Oh, I looked and looked and looked. I mean, that's an excellent question, and I wish I could tell you, yes, I found box office receipts or something for Chelsea, or I found something indicating. I don't know. I mean, I doubt they would charge the parents and relatives to come in, but maybe they did, or maybe they charged the merchants. I don't know. I suspect it was like free entertainment, and they did it because they wanted to show off the girls' accomplishments and then perhaps get more students to come to the school. It's like, look at what our students can do. And so I think it was serving that purpose. Some of the other ones, though, for the academies, we know they did sell tickets and charge, but sometimes that caused problems because then it became too accessible, and it really did completely erase the line between kind of this public concert hall type entertainment and what was happening under the auspices of an academic institution. So I strongly suspect they didn't pay, but that I do think it was open to a broad range of people, and that's why there were anxieties about it. Yeah.
That there was a school that had both boys and girls out
Mm-hmm.
they put on musical productions, and so were they completely separate, like they wouldn't perform these together, like
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happened at Cupid's coronation, it was just the girls who performed. They were separated, and just the girls performed, and they performed with their masters. So that is, they performed with their teachers. So their teachers took some of the roles that might have been unseemly for the girls to play, or the anti-mask roles in this case, and then the girls performed the more genteel parts of the mask. So there was this kind of separation. But they weren't separated from their male teachers, right? Yeah.
This kind of goes with it. So like for Dido and Aeneas, for example, like it has a 4-part chorus. And so would that be like all of the girls singing like all the different parts, or would like maybe some of the like male teachers or something be singing like bass or different parts?
If they did what they'd always done, then there might have been some male teachers singing along. I don't know about the main roles, like the sorceress or whatever. I mean, I just don't know. It could be a girl, it could not be a girl. We know in Venus and Adonis, the role of Adonis, a male role, was played by a girl, but it was played by Josias Priest's daughter, which got around because at that time, women did not show their legs. And so if you're wearing breeches, then that's showing you off to the male gaze in a way that would have been considered to be really racy. I think the only reason why they did that with Adonis was because it was the daughter of a professional, right? It was the daughter of the dancing master, so they could get away with putting her on display in that way because she was the daughter of a professional performer. I'm not sure what they did with Aeneas and Dido, if they put it up an octave and a girl sang it. But what we do know is that there's no sources besides the Chelsea libretto that are from that Chelsea performance. none. All of the musical sources come from the mid-18th century. It's much later, and it was an arrangement of what might have been done in the late 17th century. So we don't actually have Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. It does not exist, except for that libretto. But it's a great question, and it's one that all of us who work on this have puzzled over for centuries. It's like, who performed it? Were there men who were brought in to do these parts? Was it just the girls? All I can say is, given the conventions of school-based performance, it's likely that there were some men involved because that's what they always had done before. But it's possible that for Venus and Adonis and for Dido and Aeneas, for some reason, they broke the typical mold and just had all girls perform. But there's no evidence, solid evidence one way or the other. Yeah.
Another thing you mentioned is how Venus and Adonis and Dido and Aeneas would sometimes, how they'd be construed as like a lesson in chastity, or to show that moral. And do we have any idea of how that was viewed then as opposed to now, or how effective that lesson would have been?
I think it was probably about as effective then as it is now. I mean, just judging from, I found other evidence of, so the Archbishop of Canterbury, his niece ran off with a dancing master from one of these schools. And so there's this correspondence, this panicked correspondence, the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, we're trying to track her down, we think she might be in London with this dancing master. So I don't think it was effective. And I think that in some ways, it's the way that they could get away with doing it, right? They're saying, this is teaching we're performing Venus and Adonis, which was originally performed at court by the king's mistress and his illegitimate daughter. But we're going to do it at Chelsea, and it's going to be great, and it's going to be, these girls are so chaste. Just believe us, they're really chaste. And the real purpose is to teach them about, this is what not to do, okay? I think it's, it's the way they could manage to put it on and frame it so they could do it. But I think it was just ultimately for entertainment and to try to show off the girls' talents and get prospective students. Yeah.
Well, out of curiosity, though they thought that people died of love sickness, do they actually have accounts of that? And those girls would probably be able to see past that, and most people would, I think.
Yeah, it's hard to get back to the mindset of the 17th century because they believed the body worked in an entirely different way than the way we think it worked. I'm sure there were some people who were skeptical and be like, whatever, I don't believe this. This isn't going to happen to me. I'm going to do what I want anyway. But there would have been some people who would have truly, because it was a predominant way of thinking about the world, that you could have this horrible humoral imbalance, and that would make you lovesick. And then there were cases, there were all of these things written that were accounts of the bad things that happened, right? And the deaths of these women. Dido was considered to be a typical example of a lovesick woman as she was portrayed in Virgil's Aeneid. So it's hard to say, but I would say that within their mindset, some of them at least would have believed that that could be a possibility. But who knows how seriously they took it? They might have just been skeptical and said, that's not my experience. I think I'm going to be fine. So, yeah, you just don't know. Anything else? Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is that I find what you said about women playing wind instruments very interesting.
Yeah.
Especially given the ad hoc Baroque groups that we see, especially around the holidays.
Yeah.
So obviously they're really not as true to tradition as they think they are, or whatever.
It's true. Well, all of that's changed, of course,
Sure.
now. But, the tradition was that women did not play those instruments. And now something like the flute is heavily gendered as being a woman's instrument. At the time, in this period, it was absolutely not. It was forbidden.
So when did it change?
I would say it changed probably a bit later. I would say probably maybe 19th or 20th century, but that's just a guess. That's just a guess.
And don't you think the same thing sort of continued with the trombone and the trumpet until maybe the 30s.
Yes, and I wish I had a student that actually worked on this, the gendering of musical instruments and when these things changed, and I wish I had her, because she knows everything about this topic, but it is a fascinating one. Yeah, for sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Just very briefly to say, Dr. Eubanks Winkler is here also as the dramaturg for our production of Dido and Aeneas, which is happening over in the Chase Fine Arts Center tonight at 7:30, tomorrow night at 7:30, and Saturday at 2. And she's also going to give a different talk, a pre-concert talk, an hour before each of those performances in room 246. So you're all very welcome to come along. It's going to be a great production and another great talk from Dr. Eubanks Winkler.
From 6:30.
Great.
6:30 to
Yeah, it'd be like 6:30 to 7-ish. I'll take questions after, so we'll see how long it goes.
Thank you very much.